So hello, everyone, and welcome back, or if this is your first time, welcome to the Israel Dialogues. I'm Rabbi Zachary Goodman here at Holy Blossom Temple, wishing everyone a Shabbat Shalom, and thank you for being with us. I'm not going to take up any time. I just want to give you a quick reminder that next week our session is going to be held on Thursday. We have a speaker from Jerusalem, and we want to make sure that we can get to them before Shabbat starts. So mark your calendars. Will be same time, same link, everything's the same, but Thursday, November 4th for our next session. And without any further ado, I'll say thank you for taking the time to be here. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to Yara Sachs, the member of Parliament, for being with us on the panel today. And David, I'm going to turn it over to you. We're in your good hands. You're muted, though. I'm just going to ask you to unmute.
There you go. Okay. Welcome, everyone. Very pleased to have you all back with us for our fourth session on the Israel Dialogues. And like Rabbi Goodman, I'd like to remind you that next week we will not be meeting on Friday, but rather on Thursday at noon, because Uri Regev will be joining us as a guest, and he will be coming to us from Jerusalem. So we'll be doing it on Thursday at noon. Today's session focuses on Jerusalem, always a topic of interest, a topic of contention, and for many, it's been argued that Israel is at the center of the issues that challenge us all, and in particular, the Israelis, both Israeli people, the Israeli government, and its relationship with the larger Middle East, but in particular with the Palestinian communities. So for those of you who have been following the news most recently, of course, there has been ongoing concern raised with the American decision to reopen its consulate in Jerusalem. The Israeli government has expressed concern about that, as others have. Others are fully in support of it, and I'm sure it's an issue that we'll turn to today. The session is going to be led by Howard Edelman and Dylan Hanley. Howard, as all of you know, is a former distinguished professor at York University, continues to be externally active in his intellectual life and his political activism and social activism related to refugees in particular. Dylan Hanley is someone who's been very active in the organized side of the Jewish community. And Dylan is currently the Director of Public Affairs with the U15, advocating on behalf of Canada's leading research universities to the federal government. And prior to that, to his role with the U15, Dylan spent almost a decade with CIJA, Canada's leading Jewish advocacy organization, where he was responsible for government relations and university outreach. And we're very pleased to welcome Yara Sachs. Yara is the MP for York Centre. She was first elected in 2020 and has been re-elected. And as a longtime a longtime community advocate and Bathurst Manor resident, she is committed to making life better for families in York Centre. I should add that Yara earned an undergraduate degree from McGill University in Political Science and Middle East Studies, a master's degree from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem in International Relations and Diplomacy. And we're very pleased to have you with us for this particular session, which I know is a topic of great concern to you. So with that, let me turn it over to Howard and Dylan, and the session is yours. I will moderate it. For everyone in the audience who would like to ask questions, please use the chat function. That will help us monitor the questions, and we'll try to ensure that we have enough time to at least get a few of them out to our presenters. Normally, we schedule this for an hour, but we found that, in fact, an hour and a half seems to be what people prefer. So we'll see how this conversation goes. I know that Yara may have to leave before the session ends. And if that happens, we will miss you, but thank you for the time you can give. Howard and Dylan, the session is yours.
Thanks very much,
sorry,
David.
Howard, before we go, I just want a quick change. If you have a question, please do post in the Q&A function rather than the chat.
Okay.
So the Q&A is the place to pose your questions. Thank you.
Q&A. I'll monitor that with you. Thank you.
Very good. All right, Howard. It's up to
Well,
you.
it's been quite a week in Jerusalem. You not only had the Knesset approving $11 billion for the Arab sector for housing and education and infrastructure, but as David signaled, there's been quite a bit of controversy over different items between the United States and Israel. One he mentioned was over the consulate directed for the Palestinians that Biden wants to set up. But that's been the least important, I would say, because in fact, the Biden administration is pretty soft on that one. And they are faced that if they get very critical, that the coalition government they know will collapse over this issue. So that's not been a strong one. Much stronger has been the issue over the Gantz's announcement about making the 5 NGOs, human rights NGOs from the Arab sector, Palestinian sector, illegal. These are rights organizations for children, for women, for agriculture, for prisoners, etc. And that's been quite controversial. But the most controversial has been about the settlements, about new housing initiatives by Israel. And that's created quite a bit of much more controversy. And not only that, it's faced the harshest criticism from the American government. The American government overtly said, we are opposed. And that's unusual diplomatic language for America to use with Israel. Very, very strong opposition. And it's that dimension of the many, many issues of Jerusalem that we're going to get into. Now, when we get into that issue, the first thing you have to do is put it in a framework, I think. Demographic framework, a political, economic, number of them. We're going to just concentrate on 2, the demographic framework and the political framework. I'm going to do the demographic, and then Dylan will do the political framework, and then we'll concentrate on a few of the residential issues. Hopefully we'll get to Sylvan, but if we don't, we'll certainly cover the Sheikh Jarrah issues, and we'll cover the new, at least one of the new settlement projects in East Jerusalem. So let me begin with the demographic issue. And if you can, Robbie Goodman, if you could put up that chart we have prepared. And if you look at that chart on your screens, you can't help noticing what a small town Jerusalem was during the 19th century. It was an inconsequential place. Over that year, the 19th century, it grew 6-fold, but it still was a small town at the end of it. So I want to concentrate on its growth in the 20th century, but primarily on the divisions between the Jews and Muslims and Christians. And if you look at the chart, I want to highlight a few of the years. The first thing to notice is the apparent religious cleansing of the Christians from Jerusalem. It's not as if they were kicked out. It's just that their population never increased really. Whereas in, say, 1885, there were 40% of the population. By the time we got to the contemporary period, they're down to 2%. And this is just symptomatic of the Christian cleansing from the Middle East, whether it's Iraq or whether it's any of the countries. You have a huge exodus of Christians from the Middle East. If you then look at the Jews and the Muslims, it's the case that I remember being brought up with the belief that, oh, the greatest plurality in Jerusalem has always been the Jews. And it's just not true. Jews never became the largest plurality to the latter end of the 19th century. And the explosive growth of Jews occurred in response to political international events. First, the Balfour Declaration, not the first and second Aliyah, but the actual Balfour Declaration. Then the Nazi persecution of Jews in Germany, and a big growth between 1931 and 36. And then you had, of course, the conquest of West Jerusalem in the War of Independence. The big breakthrough came with the 67 war, and you see a big increase in Jewish presence in Jerusalem as the city was united under Israeli authority. But what's most interesting, I find, when you look at the demography, is that the Palestinian community increases under Jewish rule by the end, whereas it represented maybe 20% roughly, it grew to over 30% of the population of Jerusalem, and therefore sort of belied this fiction that Israel was cleansing Jerusalem of Palestinians. It may not be giving them equal services, but it's not engaged in cleansing. Now I want to turn it over to Dylan to talk more about the political framework of the controversies in Jerusalem.
Thanks, Howard. Before we start with politics, I think we have to clarify what we're talking about when we discuss Jerusalem, because, you know, in the older days, Jerusalem really only meant the old city, and it's expanded out into an area that is fairly complicated because parts are within the Green Line and parts are outside the Green Line. And, you know, even when we're talking about settlements, it's a question of in whose eyes are they actually settlements when you're talking about the southern neighborhoods around Har Homa, or the ones in the north that are still within the municipal boundaries of Jerusalem, versus, you know, those in the east, Ale Adumim and the other planned communities there. I think the other point is that if you look at the battle over Jerusalem, I'd purport that Jerusalem really is the center of the conflict. It's been the jewel of the area for a long time. And even if you look at the UNSCOP report, the UN Special Committee on Palestine's report on partition to the United Nations in 1947, it proposed a Jewish state and an Arab state, but with a UN protectorate for Jerusalem. And I think tellingly, in which Jerusalem included Bethlehem, which suggests that, again, the Christian countries that dominated the United Nations at that time saw this as something that they also would like to protect from being either governed by the new Arab state or the Jewish state. To the point of Jerusalem as a center of the conflict, especially since 1967, there's been a demographic battle underway between East Jerusalemite Arabs and the state of Israel to some extent, the Jewish community there to some extent, and I think, you know, increasingly factions of ultra-nationalists within Israel, to on the ultranational side, ensure that Jerusalem's never divided, from Israel's point of view as a whole, to make it difficult to divide Jerusalem. And I think if you look at we will look at maps of the settlements shortly, and you'll see the evidence of some of that. And on the Palestinian side, to sort of dig in their heels and make sure that they're not displaced. So on the ground, this conflict has looked like the different government plans to build neighborhoods in and around Jerusalem in what we call East Jerusalem, which is really, to the east, north, and south of the old city, everything that's not, West Jerusalem beyond the Green Line into Israel. It's been characterized by the, again, entrenchment of the Arab Palestinian residents of East Jerusalem to dig in their heels and not sell their property, and sort of the sub-conflict wherein, when the Arabs living inside Israel were offered citizenship, most of those in East Jerusalem didn't take citizenship and have been treated as permanent residents rather than citizens. One fun anecdote was around how those Palestinian citizens voted in the Palestinian elections back in 2006, and the negotiations with Israel over, the Israeli government said, well, you'll vote by mail-in ballot. And they said, well, we want to go into a voting booth, so we want the mail-in ballot boxes to look like voting boxes. And the Israelis said, no, it'll look like a mailbox. It'll have a slot in the front. The Palestinians had a slot on the top, and they ended up with a slot on the upper, angle of it, so that both sides could sort of have their way. And I think that, again, from the Palestinian side, this was trying to say, this is East Jerusalem, this is the capital of our future state, and it's not indivisible. And the other piece that is the accusations thrown at Israel from the Arab side and Palestinian side are reported difficulties in getting construction permits and in maintaining residency for residents of East Jerusalem. For example, if somebody goes away to university, it's difficult to get their residency status back afterwards, or at least those are the reports. And also, as Howard mentioned, the lack of services and infrastructure in East Jerusalem, which the residents there say is discriminatory and meant to try to encourage them to move. And on the Israeli side is often explained away by the hostility to, official government services amongst those communities. And the last piece to talk about is sort of the last 10 years or so under the Netanyahu government, and the lead up to, what we saw in the spring. And what we've seen over the last 10 years is an erosion of the status quo in Jerusalem, wherein for a long time, some of these ultranationalist groups have tried to purchase homes house to house, both in the old city and in the neighborhoods surrounding the old city, to, even if it's at a very slow pace, Judaize the area and entrench themselves in there. And Howard will talk about the specifics of the Sheikh Jarrah piece, but also inside the old city. The Haram al-Sharif, or the Temple Mount, has been under control of the Islamic Waqf from Jordan, since 1967. But over time, there have been more and more impediments put in place. Again, there have been purchases of homes. If you walk through the Muslim quarter of the old city, you can see the Israeli flags flying over your head. And each time you go back, I would go back a few times a year, there's a couple more and there's a couple more. And on the Temple Mount itself, although, the adage is Jews visit, Muslims pray up there, that it's reserved for prayer for Muslims. Whether that's fair or not, I know that there's a lot of upset inside the Jewish community that would be the case at the holiest site in Judaism. But there have been more and more cases of people up on top of the Temple Mount praying fairly openly and sort of protected by soldiers. But this causes tension on top of the Temple Mount. I can tell you, as somebody who led groups there, again, I used to go up there pretty frequently when I lived in Jerusalem back in 2006 and 7. And you would very infrequently see it. And over the years, you'd see more and more, to the point where anytime you go up there, this is sort of the situation. And in the lead up to the Sheikh Jarrah situation, I mean, the actual controversy around Sheikh Jarrah was hot and in the news in Israel and amongst East Jerusalem Arabs. But there was also a situation where the interim police chief for the border police, who'd been put in place by Netanyahu, had put restrictions on spaces inside East Jerusalem. And I would say probably the most significant one being the Damascus Gate Plaza, which is really the main square of Palestinian East Jerusalem. That I'd say makes it feel for those residents like more and more of what is theirs in Jerusalem is being taken away, and led to some of the increase in tensions that exploded in the spring. I'll turn it back to you, Howard.
Before I was going to go into detail in Sheikh Jarrah, and I will in a minute, and it's the relevant one because it's only a few blocks from the Damascus Plaza. I'd like to bring in our guest and get her reflections on Jerusalem and introduce them. Okay.
Thanks, Howard. So first of all, Dylan, thanks for the last minute ability to join in this conversation. Jerusalem's very close to my heart, having been a resident of the city for 15 years and a staffer in the office of the mayor of Jerusalem during the second Intifada. So this is certainly a subject that is near and dear to me in many ways, having it been my home for a very long time. So Howard, I want to reflect back on that demographic chart that you presented, because I really think it's an important piece of the puzzle, and it was a wonderful entryway for many on the call today to understand what the delicate balance of Jerusalem is in terms of its population. Because while it may be a unified city in terms of that there is no there's no barbed wire fence along the Green Line, and residents move fluidly in their vehicles or by bus or other modes of transport between the eastern and the western side of the city. Socially and demographically, it is a divided city. And it's a delicate balance that for many years, the municipality of Jerusalem, the state, tried to maintain at about 70-30, meaning 70% Jewish, 30% Arab or Palestinian. And those demographics have shifted as into the 2000s. It was a realization it was impossible to try and keep those demographic balance goals. And the reality is today we're looking at, in an ideal world, it's a 60-40. It's edging towards 65-35 at this point. And that continues to be where the city is. So I think we do need to recognize the demographics of the city, because it really plays out in the social interactions and the politics of the city. And the populations aren't meeting in the middle. They're not interacting. Everyone lives really in their own. It's a city of neighborhoods. People really tend to gravitate to their neighborhoods and stay there. And there isn't a lot of intermixing. Having worked in the city, I can tell you that building permits in the east part of the city are extremely limited. And there are those critics of Jerusalem and municipal politics that say it's by design to keep the Palestinian population from being able to grow and expand in its neighborhoods. And at the same time, seeing a clawback in the growth of communities. We'll talk about Atarot and Givat Motos a little bit later. But there is that constant tension of that neighborhoods, whether it's Beit Hanina or Sheikh Jarrah or other areas, that are kept encapsulated, if you will, and without the ability to have building permits, while other parts of the city are growing and shifting and changing. So there is a definite sense of inequity. And I think that's something that we need to be honest about. Infrastructure in the eastern parts of the city are vastly different from the west part of the city, and they continue to create issues of inequity between one part of the city and the other, and those spill out into sociological and political tensions. And East Jerusalem residents grapple with this. Dylan was quite right to say that residency status in East Jerusalem is something that the residents hold in a very delicate balance in dance with the Ministry of the Interior. They're only allotted a certain number of days abroad. And if they go over that, to retain their status is very, very challenging. And this was really tested a few years ago in the municipal elections. There's a gentleman by the name of Aziz Abu Sarah. If you ever have a chance to meet him when you're there, he is a wonderful tour guide and writer and a lover of Jerusalem who presents tours of the city with Jewish counterparts to really present the city and its complexities. And he and a number of East Jerusalem residents for the first time decided to run a party that would represent East Jerusalem residents in municipal elections. They are allowed to vote in the municipal elections as opposed to the national country elections. And at the end of the day, they stopped, and they were gaining a lot of support and momentum, not just from East Jerusalem residents, but actually from West Jerusalem Jewish residents who understood that a healing of the city would be a good thing in terms of its sociological and political makeup. One by one, the candidates on his lists received notices from the Ministry of the Interior that their residency status was in question of how many days they had been abroad. In some cases, some of them hadn't necessarily traveled abroad, and it was framed in the context of an investigation. And the net result of that was that the party list removed itself from the municipal election list because of fear of losing their residency status. So it creates tension, and it creates a situation where Palestinian residents of East Jerusalem for the first time, wanted to be engaged. There's also been a boycott for years of participating in municipal elections. This was the first time of a rapprochement, if you could say, and they were slapped for it. And so that creates a constant escalating of tensions that are an overlay of sociological issues and the real terms of living in the city. And I think that's the map we have to look at when we look at Sheikh Jarrah and when we look at the proposed housing developments in Atarot, which are encroaching into East Jerusalem families and communities, to understand that there's this constant tug of war of space and not of truly living together, although they are all living together. So I'd like to map it there, if I could, from my own living experience and just what we're seeing at the moment.
Well, that was terrific. No, even though the situation is terrible, but the presentation was great. Let me give one example, the Sheikh Jarrah one, because it's a relatively tiny example that received a lot of attention this past spring. And the elements are fairly simple, and they're coming to a head again next week. The land was legitimately owned by Jews before 1948. That's pretty well established. Secondly, the residents that live there now got the rights to live on the land from the Jordanians in 1956, receiving funds from the United Nations Relief and Works Agency to build their homes, with the understanding that they would now own their own land and homes. They had been displaced from other parts of Israel. The other thing that happened is legally, it wasn't properly carried out by the Jordanian authorities. So it wasn't legally conveyed, and that created a bit of a legal problem. But the more important issue is the unequal application of the law of return, the so-called law of return, or the right of return. Because here Jews, under the right of return, were able to reclaim land that they lost under the Jordanians, but the very Palestinians living in those sites can't reclaim their lands that were taken in Israel. Now, there's a compromise deal proposed by the courts. And it's a kind of way to try to escape the problem without dealing with it. And it involves a number of things. One of it says, well, let's give the ownership of the property to the legal owners, the Jewish charity that bought the rights to the land. But they wouldn't be finalized. The courts could overrule them still, and the Palestinians and residents could pursue their court case and their opposition to their eviction. There's 4 families now face immediate eviction, and we'll know next week what the ruling of the courts will be, because whether the settlers accept the residents, the Palestinian residents accept the compromise. My suspicion, very strong, is they won't. The issues are too much at stake for them, not only on the level of legal ownership, but on the whole general issue of rights to return. But the compromise did allow the Palestinians to be recognized and to continue their occupation as rightful occupants, and they'd pay a nominal rent, which so therefore in principle they'd acknowledge legal ownership belonged to others. They'd pay a nominal rent to the owners. They'd be free to renovate without any restrictions. They could also continue their legal actions to insist that they were the legitimate owners while this whole controversy played out. But there was a time limit on a 15-year time limit in which then, or perhaps earlier, they could, the owners could settle and evict them if they don't get the rights to their land, but only evict them if they, their lifetime occupancy was done. Now, why I take that as an issue, it seems tiny. We're talking about 4 families, but there's more involved behind that. There's a bunch of other families, but the issues at stake are critical. The unequal application of law, where the law that protects and gives rights to Jews are different than the law that gives rights to Palestinians. And that creates a real dilemma in the principle of law. There's a right of justice of inhabitants, of residents, that are controversies all over the world. I mean, it's not just in Jerusalem, where people live a long time in a place and then get evicted arbitrarily or for other reasons, instead of giving tenants actual occupancy rights for their life or for a long duration. So there's a number of issues come up, and it's a relevant issue to discuss. I want to now go back to Dylan, who will discuss a much bigger residential issue than this tiny one case that I've picked.
Sure. So Rabbi, maybe you can throw up the map that I sent you, if that works. So we're going to talk about the construction of settlements or neighborhoods around Jerusalem, and the planned expansion of those areas that has been quite controversial, especially, as Howard alluded, in some of the conversations with the Biden administration. So on this map, the Palestinian built-up areas are in brown. You can see the big brown blotch at the bottom, which is Bethlehem, and at the top, which is Ramallah. And these are small, areas in terms of distance for those who are familiar with Jerusalem. I mean, you can see in the yellow, which is West Jerusalem, the blue line that weaves through it is the municipal boundaries of West Jerusalem. And you all know, if you've spent time there, that's not a massive area. So Jerusalem as a whole is not a gigantic place in terms of its land imprint. If you took this map and zoomed it out, B'Tselem did a good map. It's been about 10, 20 years now. I actually looked to see if I could find an updated one that really looked like a heat map of where the settlements were in terms of population. And I mean, really, there's Ariel in the north, which occupies a sort of strategic hilltop up there, and otherwise, most of them, and the majority of the population of the settlements is sort of in a ring around Jerusalem, which suggests that I think on the positive side that the two-state solution in terms of the settlements, at least to date, is not dead. That there's actually, most of the settlers are pretty close to the Green Line. But that the clear purpose of the settlement enterprise to date has been to solidify Israel's hold on Jerusalem, to make it very difficult to give back. So there are a number of projects that are currently being proposed that are pictured in the map on screen. I'll go to E1 last. It's probably the most controversial. And I think the difference between E1 and Adarot and Givat Hamatos, and I guess Har Homai, is that the two in the north and south are within the municipal boundaries of Jerusalem, which means in Israel, like according to Israeli law, this is all considered part of the municipality of Jerusalem, although in any negotiations between the two parties, the status of Jerusalem has been negotiated, and in 2000, Ehud Barak had negotiated a division, and it's reported that Ehud Olmert did the same in his peace talks with the Palestinians in the mid 2000s. So it's still very much disputed territory, but it is a little bit different. In the south, the two red areas adjacent to Har Homa would create about 1,100 Israeli housing units, but would also isolate the Palestinian East Jerusalem neighborhood of Bet Safafa from the rest of the West Bank. And, I think help to complete the circle, if you look at it from the first blue blotch, which I'm pointing to on my screen, obviously you can't see there, out to where E1 is, and the two blue blotches past that are basically Ma'ale Adumim, and around to the north. In the north, the Adarot plan is large. It's for 9,000 homes to be built adjacent to the Kalandia checkpoint, which is the main checkpoint, if you've ever been to Ramallah, that you go through on the way there. For those familiar with northern Jerusalem, it's basically a northern extension of the Pisgat Zev neighborhood. And again, just builds up a large block. And I think the reason for the numbers is also that there's just space there and relatively flat hilltops for folks who have been up there. E1, the large red blotch on the right-hand side of the map there, has been controversial for years and years. It's interesting because every election, politicians on the right say that they're going to build an E1, that they're approving tenders for housing, et cetera. I've not ever seen any building on it. Again, for those who've been to the Dead Sea, it's sort of the big last barren hill on the right as you're driving back into Jerusalem from the Dead Sea. Ma'ale Adumim sort of on your left, and then there's a big mound of a couple hills on your right. There's a plan to build 3,500 homes there. And again, I mean, this is also outside of the boundaries of the municipal boundaries of Jerusalem. And it also completes the strategic narrowing of any future Palestinian state, where there's an outward squeeze there and a bit of a blockage in the kidney bean that is the West Bank. It just protrudes the Israeli portion further in. I will say, from my own perspective, I mean, Ma'ale Adumim's already there, and I'm not sure that anybody really thinks that it's going to go anywhere in a peaceful or in a peace agreement moving forward. But this is the big one. Again, I wonder sometimes how much of the threats are political posturing versus reality, especially with the Biden administration that's pushed back so hard. But we'll see. And yeah, I'll turn it back to Howard, or maybe we want to let Yara feed into this before you talk about Solon.
I think we should have Yara talk. She knows more about it than you and I, anyway.
I wouldn't say that. I think everyone's bringing some wonderful insight to the table today. So Dylan, that's a great map, and I appreciate you putting it out there because it really does give us a lay of the land of what's currently happening there. You know, I always like to premise this part of this discussion on Jerusalem disputed, united, and to always, and you said it really well, Dylan, we always need to recognize that Israel entered a series of negotiations that started with the Oslo Accords, where it initially said, we're willing to discuss Jerusalem. We're willing to discuss it. We're willing to have that conversation. We're willing to enter those negotiations. And I think in the diaspora communities, there's this kind of knee-jerk reaction of like, but wait a minute, it's and it's like, well, no, there was a willingness to discuss this, and we need to remember that. And subsequent governments, including Ehud Barak and my former boss, Ehud Olmert, that was the mayor that I worked under, was willing to say, yes, this is the lay of the land in Jerusalem, and this is what we've committed to. And we recognize, if we go back to that 60-40 or 65-35 demographic we talked about, like, this is the reality of this city. And we need to contend with it because that's the truth of it. What's happening now, and Dylan, I agree with you that in terms of E1, there's a lot of posturing that goes with that. It's a little bit of playing poker on that particular section. But when we get to Givat Matos and Har Homa particularly, that cutoff between Bet Safafa and the communities on the other side is significant, because it's a twofold issue. One is the cutoff of communities or families that visit between neighborhoods, but it's also a matter of that since these Palestinian communities have not been allowed to build and expand in their own areas, and they're crowded, and families can't continue to live there, the proposed housing that's going in is twofold. One is that it's been deemed to only be available for Israelis to purchase, which is problematic. And that the subsidized housing that is also going, so I think there is a plan for, I think, about 30 to 40% of the housing there to be subsidized housing as well, amongst those 1,100 units, that bars access from Palestinian residents to purchase. So it's a catch-22 situation. Is I'm a resident of the city, but you won't let me buy, you won't let me build where I am, and now you're building more and barring me access to that house of available affordable housing. And these are municipal problems. I mean, I deal with the city of Toronto with housing all the time, and in our own national plans here for affordable housing. So this is a chronic problem around the world, and Jerusalem's no different in that sense. But you have the layers of sociological divides and political conflict on top of it of, well, whose is it really anyway? And when are we going to decide what that is? I just want to point out on the Sheikh Jarrah piece, one thing that I think folks need to know. While the Benevisti Trust was the trust in terms of those specific land ownership in Sheikh Jarrah, there's also a piece to this puzzle in that the families that then moved into under Jordanian rule from 48 and were allowed to build their homes on UNRWA, when everything lifted and shifted back the other way in 67, the 1970 law did two things. One, it allowed as Jews to maintain or claim the ownership of the lands, but they were also compensated for lands that they lost. So they were able to keep the deeds to this property, but they were also provided funding from the state of Israel, acknowledging that they lost the ability to use those lands, and the residents in Sheikh Jarrah were not given equal compensation. So when we go back to this discussion of the inequities of it, it's like it comes down to that. So those properties, the ability to sell those properties out of the Benevisti Trust to Atirat Kohanim and to Nachalat Shimshon and the Jewish ultra-nationalist communities that are buying into these properties, the deeds that they're purchasing are from Jewish families who are already compensated by the state for their loss. So it's a bitter pill for Sheikh Jarrah residents to have to acknowledge that this is a constant uphill battle. And when I've been asked about, certainly as a Canadian MP, my position on Sheikh Jarrah, I say it's a detriment to us reaching a two-state solution and a conclusion on the status of Jerusalem, which both parties agreed to at certain points to negotiate. It creates another lightning rod issue that it makes it even harder and harder to reach a conclusion on a final status. And in addition to that, it erodes the ability to create trust towards a resolution of the conflict. And that's really what it comes down to. When I've been asked time and again, when I've spoken about the Sheikh Jarrah issue, I say, as you said, Howard, in other places of the world, when we talk about occupancy and landlord-tenant rights and long-term occupancy, tenants do have rights. And I have said all along in this process, while I've eyed with concern the judicial process of Sheikh Jarrah in the courts for the 4 families. I happen to know one of the 4 families that is embroiled in this. I say I have faith in the Israeli judicial system to do what is right. And that's what they're attempting to do with these compromises right now, to say, we're going to put a break in this process. We're going to cut the machinery moving forward and have everyone take a step back so that we can protect the livelihood and homes of these families who have lived there for decades, recognizing that they do have rights of what have been their households, but also understanding that there's a bigger unraveling of the laws behind it that have enabled this sale process to happen. And that's something that the court system will have to work out. We can eye it with concern, but also trust that, Israel is a democracy with a judicial system that is strong. In light of it being tested many, many times, is strong enough to withstand even this, and to look at a past legislation, whether it's the 1970 law that allowed for in some cases double compensation, but also to recognize that there's a delicate balance of this mosaic of the city of it comes back to what Howard presented in that first slide, that balance of populations of the 60-40, 70-30, 65-35, the ever-changing tapestry of the city, and how we figure out how everyone lives together in some kind of semblance of sense of ownership and narrative of their identity, a sense of belonging to this. So many people, I'll end with this because I'm keeping an eye on the time. In my many years of living in Jerusalem and working for the mayor's office in Jerusalem in Israeli politics, so many people around the world feel a sense of ownership to Jerusalem, whether it is religious, spiritual, historical, and national. And to navigate this process, and we're seeing it in the microcosm of Sheikh Jarrah of these 4 families, which there are another 15 families in the pipelines of additional cases and more potential issues in Hana al-Bitna and other areas of Silwan. We have to recognize that at the end of the day, it is I think we're up to 1 million residents of Jerusalem at this point, who will have to live with the outcomes of these conflicts and decisions. And we have to remember that at the end of the day, we over here, as we discuss this, want to be facilitators and bridges to ensure that it is a safe and beautiful and magnificent city that we all feel connected to. But at the end of the day, we want the residents, all of the residents of the city, there to feel safe in their homes, both in terms of security of having a roof over their head and also security in the bigger political picture.
Yara, before getting into Silva, and I want to make use of your time with us, let me ask you a question about the religious dimension, not just the Palestinian versus Jewish Israeli, because Dylan mentioned that in the UNSCOP report, Jerusalem was to be an international city. And that recommendation came from the Peruvian delegate on UNSCOP, who made it and insisted on it and got it through as a compromise, because he would then agreed to vote for a two-state solution. He wouldn't vote for it unless it was internationalized. So you were right about people around the world feeling very possessive about Jerusalem. Does that Christian element currently play much of a significant part anymore?
I think the Christian evangelical community abroad certainly attempts to lay its hat firmly in the Knesset when it can. I know at different times there's been different lobby groups that have found their way into the Knesset to show their sense of allegiance and support and influence on political outcomes when it comes to Jerusalem. But I also, having worked in Israeli politics, we welcome everyone who supports us, but we also are very firm in, and now I'm not speaking as an MP, I'm speaking as an Israeli. We're also very clear on our role and responsibilities that come as the caretakers of this city. One of the most beautiful working relationships I had when I worked in the mayor's office when I first started as a young intern was with a woman named Naomi Teasdale, who was about yay big, a British woman, who was the religious affairs advisor, and it was her responsibility to work with the various churches and the Waqf and so on in the maintenance of the delicate balance between the different religious communities that claim ownership and sovereignty in the city, whether it was the Scottish Mission or the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and so on. One of the projects I worked on with her was the re-roofing of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And you can only imagine having to get everyone in their splendor of uniforms coming into a boardroom to talk about who owns what, and everyone willing to put money on the table to fix the roof because they thought it would give them an edge in ownership and in real estate on the property. So I would say when it comes to the Israeli role in working with the Christian community abroad or within Israel or with any of the religious communities that have an affiliation and connection to the city, we are the gatekeepers of it, but we also hold tremendous responsibility in maintaining it, and we can never lose sight of that. And for those of us who love Jerusalem from abroad, we say Libi Mizrach, Yad Yamini, not to lose I would lose my right hand before abandoning Jerusalem. We also have to remember that with our love and desire to keep it peaceful and safe comes tremendous responsibility to all of the people who live there. And I think as we discuss it here, we always have to keep that in mind when we ponder of what to do and how we feel about it.
But it gets into terrific fights over demolitions as well.
It does.
The Mormons created the park around the old city. You have Sylvan, which is a combination attempt to be park, attempt to be a number of things related to tourism, but there are people who've been living there for not just decades, but centuries.
Yeah. Yes, the Sylvan Valley.
Comment on that kind of effort to improve a city through demolitions, but always having a political agenda almost every time behind it.
Yes. Well, I feel strongly that, and I mentioned this earlier, if we look at, if we were to treat East Jerusalem or recognize that East Jerusalem residents have an equal stake in the mapping and the shaping of the city, whether it's through their political involvement, community involvement, development planning, permits being issued, I think we would see less, and if we saw fewer demolitions and more collaborative efforts for urban planning, I think we would see a safer city and a more peaceful one. And certainly in the hat that I wear now as an Israeli Canadian MP, it's my utmost desire when I'm in these forums to say that's really what we should be advocating for is that collaborative approach of recognizing that we may not be at final status, but at the end of the day, all the residents of this city need to live together and to live there equitably and justly.
Maybe we can bring in our other participants, David, and I don't know who's here today, actually. If you have comments or questions, then let's broaden the scope of this.
Well, let me turn to Mark Manchin first, who's been able to join us now, because Mark has background in this. He's looked at it as a lawyer and as a longtime activist. So he may want to introduce some either new things or comment on what you and Dylan already have. And then I have Jennifer Malvin, who asked a question quite a while ago that I'll pose to you afterwards.
Thank you, David and Howard, and thank you, Yara, for joining us. We really appreciate you being with us and taking the time out of your busy schedule as an MP. It's been great to see you with us today. One of the things that I just want to go back to a point that Dylan raised with the UNSCOP report establishing Jerusalem as an international city. And it seems to me that events have sort of overtaken that ideal from 1947, from the partition resolution. In other words, it's hard to imagine that Jerusalem will become an international city recognized by the international community as a practical matter. And so it seems to me that one of the points regarding Jerusalem in terms of its being a very controversial and critical central issue to the conflict is how to resolve the international recognition of the city by countries. In other words, when will countries begin to recognize, most countries begin to recognize, as the US has, Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, and leaving for the negotiations as to whether or not part of Jerusalem, that being the eastern part of Jerusalem, becomes capital of an eventual Palestinian state. And one proposition I'd like to put out is that it seems to me to move the dial, to have sort of a breakthrough or a tipping point on this issue would be for countries to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, move their embassies to at least the western part of Jerusalem, which we know will never be returned, it will always be part of Israel, move their embassies there, and then leave to negotiation the question of what the boundary should be between the east and west side of the city, on the assumption that East Jerusalem may in fact become the capital of a Palestinian state. So I'd like to get some thoughts to that proposition.
I'll jump in, Mark. I mean, I think that this is something we talk about a lot in political terms. And you know, when the embassy was moved, I mean, I'll say I don't understand what the controversy is in a country determining its own capital, given that the Knesset and the rest of the government buildings are in West Jerusalem and all of what was Israel since 1948. And I remember I was in Israel with a delegation at the time that happened, and they sort of said, "Well, isn't this terrible that Trump did this, and doesn't it seem like a step in the wrong direction for peace?" And I said, well, I'm not sure that it's the best thing for Israel that Trump was the one to do it, although maybe it'll go down. I mean, I think some of the things that Trump accomplished in the Middle East may have lasting positive implications just by shaking up the status quo. I mean, you think about the Abraham Accords. But I said, Donald Trump came to this position. The position of the Jewish community has been the same for 3,000 years. This is the capital of the Jewish people. This was the center of the Zionist enterprise. When they talked about going to Uganda or Argentina, and answered the question that the only place for the Jewish people to reconstitute their home was in the land of Israel. I mean, really, Jerusalem's at the heart of that. So I think that that's a point that we all need to do a better job of explaining, to folks in our own political milieus, and people are often surprised. I mean, they think that all of Jerusalem was taken in 1967. They think that there must be some sort of controversy there. That again, I don't really see what the reason is for that controversy.
I agree with you, Dylan. And it's one of the few things I think Trump did that was right, though he did it for the very wrong reasons. And wish it would have been somebody else who did it.
So just to finish off, would you both agree that it would be appropriate for Canada and other like nations to move their embassies to the to West Jerusalem?
I think it would be, even if it would create a big fight here. But I don't think it'll happen. But I think it would definitely, and your suggestion is right. Why not move it to West Jerusalem? Doesn't make any sense.
I think if there's a conservative government here that it might. And I also think it sort of depends on how the global political discussions evolve. And again, I think the worry for me is just, it's the wrong camp that's motivated to go out and do this to a certain extent. I don't mean that by the Conservative Party inside Canada. I mean, Aaron O'Toole's committed to it and recommitted to it, during the election campaign, and he's not a hard right conservative leader. But I do worry about the sort of Scott Morrison in Australia, like the global forces that might be a bit aligned with Trump, being the ones to lead the charge, because I think sometimes Israel gets more tarnished by association with them than anything else.
On this issue, for a long time following 1967, the controversy was around West Jerusalem versus Jerusalem, or West Jerusalem versus East Jerusalem. And then there was a controversy around Western versus Eastern. It seems to me that on this issue, if the focus is on, for instance, as Mark has suggested, relocating embassies in West Jerusalem, it confirms, my mind, a shift in the reality of the politics of the Israeli-Palestinian dialogue, realities, that it creates an opportunity for an acknowledgement that both communities have a just access, a just right, and space in which they can establish some degree of permanence and presence and identification. So West Jerusalem, East Jerusalem, if you want, and then if you talk about Jerusalem without the adjective, perhaps you're then moving into a consideration of Jerusalem in a new form, whether we don't any longer go down the road to the internationalization or an international city, but Jerusalem signifies that both Palestinians and Israelis have a political commitment to collaborate and cooperate on the well-being of East and West unified as a single place. I think there are ways you could do it if you had the trust and confidence. I don't think you're there yet. Certainly having countries establish embassies in West Jerusalem might move things further along faster.
David, you said you had a question from one of our listeners.
Yes, this is a question from very early on, from Jennifer Melvin. She asked, was there any correlation between the rise in Christian population and the drop in Muslim population from 1876 to 1885? So that's drawing from the data that you had put up earlier.
I can't answer that question very definitively, because I just know the population changes, and I really don't know the forces that affected them. though it was clear that in the latter half of the 19th century, as the Western powers grew and their imperialism grew more extensive and more effective, that they began to get more control in areas like the Ottoman Empire, and therefore pushed other peoples out. And you had this tension always going along in these cities with these pressures that go back. I didn't include the periods of the Crusades when the Christians dominated the city and was mainly a Christian city, or when it was, Saladin had the city, it was overwhelmingly a Muslim city. So it goes through all those phases, and that was a phase of the development in the modern period.
Let me ask the three of you the following. Recently, we've seen some tension between Israel, the United States, and the Palestinians over the issue of reopening a consulate. That the Americans determined that they were going to reopen their consulate for the Palestinians in East Jerusalem. The Israelis counter-proposed that the Americans should open their consulate in Ramallah. The Palestinians were strongly opposed to that. I'm wondering if you'd like to, any of you, expand a little bit about that, whether that was simply a tit for tat, a theater, and what wasn't serious, or it was emblematic of something that's underlying and much greater concern.
Well, it depends on greater concern to whom. I intimated that it was not a major concern of the Americans, even though they're making an issue of it, because they more or less have granted that Israel controls, as wish John Allen was around and he could tell us exactly how they're exercised. But you can't set up diplomatic missions without the agreement of the country in power. And the Americans concede that. The Americans also recognize that this is one of those issues which will force the coalition government, which is on a delicate balance, to collapse. And why would you want the government to collapse over such a marginal issue? So though they're making rhetorical gestures towards the Palestinians to do it, I don't think there's a lot of oomph behind their efforts. I don't know. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I would add to that Canada has a representative office in Ramallah, and we've had a Canadian representative to the Palestinian Authority representing us. It's situated in Ramallah. It turns out that all of the Canadian-based Canadian officials who work in the Ramallah office actually live in Jerusalem and commute every day through the checkpoint that Dylan referred to get to the office in Ramallah. And it seems to me, as a practical matter, that for Palestinians who actually want to have who have business to do with the Canadian government, as an example, it's easier for them to get to the Ramallah office than it would be for them to get to a consulate in Jerusalem. For most of the Palestinians who don't have access into Jerusalem and can't come through the checkpoints to Jerusalem anyway. So, from a practical point of view, it seems to me it would, for a short-term solution, it would make more sense for the Americans to have an office in Ramallah the same way that Canada and many other countries do, including Australia and others.
I guess what I would say is that I think that it's clearly sort of all politics in terms of what the American administration is trying to do, which I think is walk back Trump's sort of unilateral recognition. And although his statement suggested he wasn't prejudicing the final outcomes of negotiations, recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital without pronouncing on the Palestinian side, I think this is the Biden people saying, we're going to try to reinstate ourselves as a little bit more of an honest broker by really planting a bit of a flag there in East Jerusalem. And I mean, what I think about it, I sort of agree with the analysis. Better not rock the boat with the coalition inside Israel. And obviously, I mean, Netanyahu's working to try to come back to power as quickly as he's able to. And it creates a nice wedge for him on the right in terms of Israeli politics.
There are no further questions from viewers. So unless there's a major issue on this particular topic, and I'm sure we're going to keep coming back to Jerusalem in one way or another.
David, I think there are questions, aren't there? In the Q&A?
They've just popped up. I've just gotten some more. Thank you. There's one from Jack Kreppel. Let me read it. With all due respect to all views, does anyone really believe that any Israeli judicial judgment, other than fully handing over East Jerusalem to the Arabs, will ever satisfy anybody, especially the Arab leadership, without giving up Israel as a whole?
I think you'll never satisfy every single person on the Arab/Palestinian side. I think that the Abraham Accords show you that, you know, it's a pretty warm peace that's developing with the UAE. Reportedly, we're on our way towards peace with the Saudis. And so I don't know that you can hope for what Netanyahu's asked for, you know, in terms of recognition of a quote unquote Jewish state and the embrace of it. And I think that goes to the heart of the conflict, the nagging, you know, feeling amongst the Jewish community and Israelis saying, well, we aren't really accepted here. And no matter what they're kind of going to say, it's always short term and we're not accepted. But I think if you take it to another context, for example, looking at Ireland, I was just having this conversation with somebody from Ireland the other day. You know, I mean, I think they've come to what hopefully will be a long-term lasting solution for Northern Ireland. But I don't think that the Republican Irish are ever going to say, yes, Belfast is the United Kingdom and we embrace it as such. So, I mean, I think if you can establish facts on the ground, that's about the best that you're able to do. And by the way, I also think that, you know, the demographic battles over Jerusalem, I don't think that there's a ton of altruism. Well, sorry, not altruism. Both sides are playing hardball and both sides are playing the long game. And, you know, Jews waited a long time to get Jerusalem back. And I think the Palestinians, or at least a good number of them, also have patience to dig in their heels, these families that are in Sheikh Jarrah. I mean, they couldn't go elsewhere, they could, but they're doing what they're doing because they feel like it's part of something larger. And that's the same thing in Silwan. And that's the heart of the conflict. You know, people are trying to dig in their heels. They're trying to create facts on the ground to make sure that this will go down as, you know, an inheritance for their side. And I think that those who support a two-state solution say, yes, the claims are valid on our side and on the other, whichever side you come from. But unless you're willing to compromise, we're never going to be able to get to any kind of workable peace.
But Dylan, don't you think, if you think back to when you first got involved, and we supported, you and I think, supported the division of Jerusalem, that the facts on the ground and the right agenda have in fact won over the case, and that it's gotten almost impossible to redivide Jerusalem? Don't you think that's the reality? And therefore, the idea of a divided Jerusalem now is rhetorical rather than real.
I think that's probably true. And I think, you know, as I said, I don't think anybody imagines Ma'ale Adumim going anywhere. And I guess that this is the race, you know, when they talk about the race for the two-state solution, those who are going out there putting down roots inside the West Bank know what they're doing. And to a certain extent, it's worked. And although, you know, I'm a supporter of the two-state solution. I mean, that's how Israel was created. People went in, they put down roots, they established communities, and so I don't think that it's clear and black and white in terms of the, you know, moral case in all of those situations. I just think that we have to salvage whatever piece we're going to be able to, lest we wind up in a situation where Israel has to choose between ruling over all of those Palestinians, presumably without citizenship, which is, you know, not a political system that gels well with democracy, or democracy in which Jews won't or may not be the majority.
But take the issue of Area C. We're getting outside of Jerusalem, but here is an area that is the West Bank, but in fact now has by far 80% Jews in Area C. You've got 400 to 500,000 Jews living there, and only 100,000 Palestinians left. So you've got a situation in which facts on the ground and the right-wing agenda of establishing facts on the ground have in fact established those facts. And therefore, even the problem of dividing the West Bank is now an issue at stake. So if you want a two-state solution, it's going to be a very different two-state than the Green Line solution.
So I don't know. I think that's a bit, it's true that Jews are the majority of the population in Area C, but I think this is sort of the reverse of some of the propaganda maps that are put out there by the people that promote boycott, divestment, and sanctions that show disappearing Palestine. We had all the land, and now we're reduced to, you know, these small enclaves. I mean, the truth is most of Area C is empty desert and hills that have nobody in them. And so the question is, how big are and most of the Jewish settlers or whatever communities are pretty closely adjacent to the Green Line. And David Makovsky and Dennis Ross, you know, had pushed this idea probably 10 years ago of borders first in terms of a way of solving the conflict. And they came up with a bunch of different maps. I probably actually have them somewhere for our own sidebar discussions that were very interesting, that looked at, you know, how you can incorporate those settlements in it and where you could swap some land back. I think that, and I also think that, you know, you haven't seen the growth of large scale communities that far from the Green Line, which again says something to me about the decisions around the cabinet table, because for sure, the Yesha Council and others that are advocating for the settlement enterprise are pushing for them. You know, I think that another fascinating discussion, probably for a different time, is just the status of the Jordan Valley and whether it's really practical that Israel is ever going to evacuate the Jordan Valley. And we've heard some of those proposals for Israel to hold on to it, and what that does to a future Palestinian state. But I still don't think it's impossible based on where the populations are. The Jerusalem piece, though, I'll give you. I mean, it is, if you spend time there and you see it, it's pretty hard to imagine. And even the proposals of dividing the old city. I mean, when you really go into the old city, you know, you go up on the rooftops and it's sort of like, all right, well, this part is the Jewish quarter, but under is the Muslim quarter, and you know, this part is Christian, and the lines are definitely not clean.
I think on that note, let me just ask if Mark or Howard, you have any final short word or two that you'd like to leave us with, and then I'll turn it back to Rabbi Goodman.
I'll leave it to Rabbi Goodman.
Okay. Rabbi Goodman, over to you.
I certainly don't want the last word on this topic, but I will say and end with gratitude. Thank you to each of you for your time, for your expertise. You really shed a lot of nuance on a extremely complicated situation. And so I appreciate you, and I've learned from you this day and every other previous session as well. I want to just again mention, to mark your calendars, that next week we'll be with Rabbi Uri Regev on Thursday, same time, noon at Thursday, and not meeting on Friday. We want to thank each of you for joining us on the panel, and everyone who's joining us as an attendee for this session and for all of our sessions. Wishing everyone Shabbat Shalom. Take care.
Pleasure.
Shalom.